Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin day 1 of Unit 5.4, Industrialization Spreads. So in the last video we did talk about the Industrial Revolution kind of making its way out of England. But today I kind of want to focus in on who some of the winners were and who some of the some of those who did not win in this reality of the Industrial Revolution and in this kind of, this very dramatic change in history. So, as far as when we're done that, we'll also do a little Russia application with the Industrial Revolution. And after the video, after I do my normal conclusion, I will do a little add-on of some slides I've kind of come across over Russia, just to give you a little bit more depth. But your homework, your homework does give you sufficient, so don't feel like you have to. Okay. All right. And then of course we'll be doing skill practice on Russia. All right. So our objective today: explain how different modes and locations of production have developed and changed over time. All right. So yes. All right. And there's our standards. All right, the Industrial Revolution spreads. All right, so this is just a basic infographic, and we do have some illustrative examples or illustrative examples, from the College Board. Let me kind of just go back real quick. So shipbuilding in India and Southeast Asia, ironworks in India, and then textile production in India and in Egypt. So this is just an infographic map showing you that the Industrial Revolution spread and where those illustrative examples or illustrative examples are on the map. And I will take a minute and we'll kind of go over some facts on that just to give you a little bit of evidence in case you ever come across something. You've at least been presented with it. Okay. All right. So in the last session, we went through the spread of the industrialization. We have here in these first couple of examples the spread and the application of the Industrial Revolution in these places brought by entrepreneurs. Okay, as well as in Germany, right? France is more of a hybrid, where it was some government intervention, to promote it after the 1830 revolution. And then, of course, we have two very clear cases of government intervention to promote the industrialization of their society by Japan and by Russia. So we kind of discussed that. So tomorrow we're going to be doing Japan, and today we'll do a little Russia application. Okay. I think yesterday we talked about Lowell, and just another example of an entrepreneur, on the kind of forefront of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, of course, would be Slater. So Slater's Mill, in New England. So there you go, Rhode Island. Cockerell was mentioned yesterday as far as the spreading of the Industrial Revolution out of England into Belgium. This is a little bit of a different example here. We're not. I mean, it's still it's still the bringing of the Industrial Revolution to a place outside of England by an entrepreneur. But it's a little different than the American example where it was a worker who had memorized the plans and all this. In the case of Cockerell, it's an actual factory owner, who then goes, and does this. So, and of course, by the 40s, by the 1840s, they're a massive steel producer. And I will say, having driven across the Belgian countryside, I was pretty impressed by the sheer volume of canals that span the Belgian countryside. I guess coming in. I was driving across. I was driving from Paris to Amsterdam, and maybe it's just a route I chose. I don't know, or that Google Maps gave me. But I ended up taking back roads for a pretty large percentage of the Belgian countryside. And yeah, I mean, it was a very well networked via canals country. So, and I guess you would have to do that if you are dominating the steelmaking industry, because of you have to move the iron, the coal, right, and of course your finished product, your steel once you're done. So, it's that's the realities of the environmental impact of having such an industry there. and in Russia, which we are going to talk about Russia, and I'm going to come back to this slide about Sergei Witt, in a few minutes. I just want to talk about some of the illustrative examples and all that first. All right, so I'm going to skip by some of this stuff. All right, and just kind of get into these effects. Not to spend a lot of time on this because a lot of your homeworks in the next week and a half or so are going to cover this. I do want to just kind of mention some of this stuff so that when you're coming across it and you're reading, it's not going to be the first time that you're seeing it. So when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and the global impact of the Industrial Revolution as it spreads, when you're talking about Latin America, right? When you're referencing Latin America and how the Industrial Revolution impacts Latin America, this is a really good example of a continuity. During the previous period, 1450 to 1750, when we talked about Latin America, and one of the constants was resource extraction. Of course, silver mining being the dominant thing, and resource extraction will continue to be the story of Latin America, right? So copper, zinc, cobalt, manganese, as well as silver. Right? Silver will continue to be extracted. The big change here during this time period is, for the first part, it's going to be a continuity. But about halfway through this time period, so by the time you get to the 1820s or so, it's no longer going to be colonial authorities that are extracting these resources. It's now going to become entrepreneurs and eventually corporations are going to, once we start getting into the mid-1800s. So the continuity is resource extraction. What changes is who is doing the extracting. We're also going to see resource extraction now in Africa of raw materials. During the previous time period, 1450 to 1750, we have human resource extraction. We have, through chattel slavery. But we're not really talking about a lot of raw materials or, resource extraction that way. So during this time period, especially once we get into the mid to late 1800s, we're going to start to see large scale resource extraction beginning on the African continent. Sometimes done through colonial authority, but more often being done by corporations. And we'll look at some of those as well. Obviously, this reference here is referencing the De Beers Corporation. All right. So transnational businesses are going to become part of the story by the end of this time period. So these are things that just were. There's a few examples if you want to reference the British East India Company or the VOC or companies like that, or joint stock companies. As a transnational business, maybe you can reference them as that, but transnational corporations are going to be, prevalent by the time we get to the end of the 1800s or the end of our current time period. And of course, some of the case studies we're going to look at are the United Fruit Company, they still exist today, just by a different symbol and by a different name. So we'll be looking at them, in a few days. And of course, HSBC, and this is definitely one of those interesting case studies as well. So the Hong Kong, Singapore Banking Corporation. So that makes it sound like it's a Chinese bank, but it's actually a British bank. And so we'll look at them as well and how they make their initial profits. All right, so but I do want to kind of get into a little Russia today and Egypt. So let's move on. All right, so very quickly, the illustrative examples or illustrative examples given to us by the College Board, right, about the global effects of the spread of the Industrial Revolution are really three things, right? So the ironworks in India, shipbuilding, right? So the ironworks in South Asia here in India, shipbuilding in India and Southeast Asia, and textile manufacturing. All right, so let's just take a quick second. And in class, I provide notes on this, so the students will take notes on this. And largely what they're taking notes on is this. So let's just kind of zoom in on this so we can see it really well. If you're watching this video or watching it off from this webpage, I am literally just pulling this off from the webpage that you're watching right now. All right, so this is shipbuilding in India in Southeast Asia. So initially, Southeast Asia, produced much of the merchant vessels in the Indian Ocean. And you can see as the Europeans enter this market, they're going to start to join the others in purchasing their merchant fleet out of South and Southeast Asia. Eventually, once you start getting into the early 1800s, you're going to see, things like the VOC disappear, right? They'll go away as the Dutch East India Company becomes more and more dominant, and the British is gonna force those shipbuilders to only sell to them, eliminate the competition within the Indian Ocean world, and then eventually, by the time we get to the late 1800s, this transition will begin earlier. The transition will begin in the early 1800s, like you do start to see steel ships, very famously by the 1830s, that are being built and used by the British, But I mean, as far as practically eliminating this industry, it's going to be more towards the later part of the 1800s and early 20th century that the transition to steel ships is going to have a major impact on these production centers. All right. Today, when we think about ships in Southeast Asia, you don't really think about shipbuilding necessarily. You kind of more think about ship breakers. And there's some pretty interesting videos out there about the ship breakers. If you are so inclined to watch that kind of stuff. So there's the large cargo ships that are responsible for moving so much of the goods today in our globalized economy. When they come to the end of their lifespan, they're often brought to Southeast Asia, specifically places like Bangladesh. And the process is kind of cool. They basically go as fast as they can and try to ram them up into close to shore as you can, and then the ship breakers come and take it apart, dismantle the ships, so that the raw materials that the ship is made out of, the steel can be recycled. So it's kind of an interesting thing. All right. As far as ironworks in India, right? Ironworks in India, there was an established tradition of iron mines and iron, manufacturing centers before the colonization of South Asia by the British. But when the British do come in and take over, those centers are going to be shut down, and so really this is going to be a hamstringing of economic development by the British of South Asia, and the reason for doing so is to prevent rebellions. So there's no shortage of rebellions against the British East India Company as they began to increasingly assert their control and authority over the South Asian continent. And then once we get into the 1860s and the establishment of the British Raj, then they are going to definitely want to prevent any kind of armed insurrection. So the shutting down of the ironworks is part of that transition. So it doesn't have to do with the inability of South Asia to compete in steel manufacturing or steel production with the industrialized societies. This has to do with colonization and forced shutdown. All right, and then there's textile production, and this is kind of an interesting thing. All right, so cotton production. Now, if we're talking about textile production, of course, the Industrial Revolution is a textile revolution, right? It's an energy revolution in that we're using coal and a new form of energy that can be extracted. But what are they extracting it for? They're extracting it for the manufacturing of textiles. So India or South Asia had largely been dominant in the textile production, around the world, or at least So by the time we get into the 1600s, early 1700s, South Asia accounted for as much as, maybe around 20%, maybe upwards of about a quarter of global GDP, gross domestic product globally. So a lot of the world's wealth was being generated by the textile industry in South Asia. That's not all textiles, but a lot of it was. And even by the mid 1800s, right before British rule, so before the first British Revolution or Revolutionary War, the first Indian Revolutionary War, or the Sepoy Rebellion, as it's also referred to as. Right before that, South Asia was still holding its own economically. So its share of global GDP had fallen a little bit, but still accounted for, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to to 17% of global GDP, right? So things were going pretty good, right? And then between 1860 and the turn of the 20th century, something changed, right? So South Asia goes from 1/5 of global GDP, creating 1/5 of global wealth, down to less than 1%, right? So what happens in that very short period of time? And the answer is, pretty simply, the Raj happens, right? And kind of to understand this a little bit better as well, there's an infographic I really kind of like to use. So I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between these two images. All right, so this is an infographic that shows cotton shipments, and it shows where the cotton is being shipped to. So, and when it's being shipped and where it's being shipped from. So the major receivers of cotton in 1858 are England and Europe. So you see some Belgium, Germany, maybe a little bit of France, right? A little bit of Spain is receiving, but primarily England is the largest single importer of cotton, and the largest single importer of cotton in the world was the United States of America. Exporter was the United States of America. But you also see there are a couple of other exporters that are being represented on this infographic. This darker brown color is Egypt, and this orangey, maybe beige color is South Asia. So we see here in 1858, South Asia is supplying Europe with a sizable amount of cotton. Egypt, right, less so, and then we see this. We see this massive amount from the United States, and then something happens in the United States, and of course, you should be able to try to figure out what happened between 1861 and 1865, right? So that when we see this next infographic here from 1864, what caused the cotton supply from the United States to dry up, right? Obviously, the U.S. Civil War takes place. And when the U.S. Civil War takes place, the Union, the northern states, they will blockade the southern ports, right? They'll blockade the South's ability to export cotton to generate revenue that would help finance the war effort. So you do see some of this stuff get exported out via smugglers. You definitely have some going down to places like Mexico where it then can be sold, but for the most part, it dries up. And, if you know anything at all about basic economic laws of supply and demand and their effects on price, if demand for a product like cotton stays the same, but the supply decreases, then the price for that product will go up, right? So there's going to be an explosion in price. So as cotton supplies around the world or from North America dries up and becomes zero, the price of cotton exploded. And we see a very quick transition, in cotton from going to Europe from North America to being from North America exporting to India exporting. And the reason for this is simple. The actual capacity to grow the cotton was already being used. What changes is policies. By 1864, the British Raj is in place. It is an official colony. And what we see here is because of the U.S. Civil War, the British are going to force farmers in South Asia, in India, to grow cash crops like cotton. But more than just that, the raw materials are then going to be sent, and then made to bring the clothes. And obviously they're going to send them back. But the real kicker, here is that the way the British do this is they create a situation where Indian manufacturers were not allowed to purchase that cotton until the British demands had been met. So, right, what you're seeing here in this image is this capacity is almost instantly met by the South Asians, because instead of selling that cotton that is being grown in South Asia to South Asian textile manufacturers, that cotton was now being sent overseas. So the raw materials dried up for South Asian manufacturers, and hence textiles were then only being produced in England, and then once that happens, you now have to buy those goods from England instead of your own country. So what we see happen here really quickly as a result in South Asia is South Asia goes from modern day India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, goes from being one of the controlling 1/5 of global GDP, one of the largest economies on the planet, to largely a place where resources like cotton are being extracted from. Manufacturing ceases. Right? Manufacturing completely comes to an end. So that's why their share of global GDP simply evaporates. There's also some other factors that come into play here as well. Once the building of railroads starts to go into play, the British can determine winners and losers in South Asia as well by where they decide to route those railroads. So places that may have traditionally been strong manufacturing centers, those places can be cut out of the railroad system if they don't come around. All right. So the story of those who don't win, right? The stories of those who don't win. It's not like it's a zero-sum game when you're talking about the Industrial Revolution. It's not like just because England is a winner that South Asia has to be a loser, right? It's not necessarily like that. There's certain decisions that are made which created those have-nots in this situation, right? So what happens with South Asia is not a result of South Asia being unable to compete head-to-head, on price against British textiles. That's not what happened, right? So one of those other important things. Now, what happens in the Egyptian case is a bit of a different story, though. The Egyptian case is decisions being made by the Egyptian government itself, not by a colonial imperial authority coming in and taking over. So I'm going to skip by some of this because some of this doesn't apply to what we're talking about right now per se. But so in class, I just kind of look at this. So what we see in this image is Egypt was not a major supplier. And then by 1864, you see they are definitely online and have dramatically increased cotton production by the end of the Civil War. And you see a year-over-year growth, pretty sizable year-over-year growth, where you're not really seeing that in South Asia because in South Asia, we're simply replacing what already existed. So by 1864, they had already started sending all that cotton over. So you're not seeing a huge increase. If anything, you're seeing a decrease as Egyptian cotton becomes a cheaper source. All right. So what we're seeing here in Egypt, though, is the Egyptian government itself makes a decision to restructure their economy around cash crops. I mean, why not cash in on a commodity boom, when it's happening? And this is where the issue happens, right? So the Egyptians will take out loans from the French and British lenders at crazy high interest rates, right? 25% plus interest on a loan is a very high interest rate. But they need those in order to fund the irrigation. Cotton is a very water-intense crop, and right, you need to fund that. I mean, you need to create those canals. So, in order to grow cotton on a large scale or increase their production of cotton, they needed to fund this massive works project. So they took out these huge loans. And when the Civil War ends, right, and we kind of see here in this next infographic, when the Civil War does come to an end, once again, demand stays the same. Supply will now start to shift because supply is going to start increasing coming in from the United States. So supply has now, this right here is probably not pre-Civil War supply levels, and this may not either. But you are going to start to see an increase in supply beginning in 1865, and as the years go by after 1865, which is the year when the Civil War comes to an end in the United States, as year goes on, the United States is going to kind of restore its cotton supply back to where it was before. So once again, demand remains the same. Supply now begins to increase. Prices are going to drop, and what happens in the case of Egypt is they've taken out all these loans at exorbitantly high interest rates, which means their payments are dependent upon cotton being of a certain price. Once cotton starts to fall below that price, then they're going to be unable to pay these loans back. And Egypt will try to pay these loans back. They will, they will try for the next 10 to 15 years to pay these loans back. And keep in mind, they are also in debt from the Suez Canal as well. The construction of the Suez Canal. But eventually they're going to hit a point where they are unable to pay their loans back. So you start to see some turmoil in the mid 1870s in Egypt. And then, eventually the British will use this as an excuse to take over the decision-making rights of the government and turn Egypt into a protectorate in 1882. So, a loss of sovereignty by Egypt, will be the result of this. Okay, all right. So there's that. All right. So once again, and you're starting to see this now in your readings, right? So the kind of resources that are being sought after. As a result of industrialization. So in your, I know in your most recent reading, guano figured permanently in that reading. All right. Okay, so let's talk about Russia real quick. Do a little skill application, and then we'll wrap it up. All right. So as far as the industrialization of Russia is concerned. In the spread of the Industrial Revolution to Russia, Sergei Witt is definitely the kind of main player in the story. Russia had been going along pretty good for the past couple hundred years before this story. I guess I really wouldn't say that they defeated Napoleon. They kind of came to a stalemate with Napoleon. So I guess that's probably the closest thing to not a victory. But you do have a Russian setback in the 1850s, with the Crimean War. And one of the realities of the Crimean War for Russia is it is a wake-up call when it comes to technology. And where militarily technology was and where Russia was, and they really got to see that gap. Russia definitely had numbers, right? But technologically, they were way behind. So you start to see some change beginning after the Crimean War in the 1850s. So, and trying to see here. If you look down here, thing's going to pop up every time I do it. You can see where Crimea is if you don't know where Crimea is. It's the northern part of the Black Sea, so modern-day Ukraine. It's basically right here where the Q&A is. You can kind of see that. It's a little peninsula, right, that hangs down. All right, so, but Sergei Witt is is definitely our person here, right, as far as, industrialization. So in the case of Russia, this is a government intervention in order to industrialize the country, right? And so he will be appointed to the finance minister in 1892, and then eventually prime minister and minister of transportation. But he's the strongest advocate for industrialization. So if I had a claim, or if I had made the assertion that Russia had undergone the industrialization or Russian industrialization was a result of government intervention. If I had made a claim with that kind of category of analysis, right? So, asserting that Russia and industrialization happened because of government intervention, where in this passage could I find some support or some evidence to support that claim? So, for example, right, if I am writing the DBQ, and now I'm in that body paragraph, and I'm looking to prove the assertion, to support my claim that Russia industrialized as a result of government intervention. Where can I find evidence in this paragraph, right? Or where can I find evidence of the role of government in the process? So what we do in class with this is read through this, have kids kind of just write down somewhere between like 3 to 5 words, right? 3 to 5 words that support that government played a role in industrialization. And then we'll kind of just leave it at that, and we'll talk about it in a minute. So go ahead and pause, write down your 3 to 5 words from this document that would support the assertion that the government played a role in the process of Russian industrialization. All right. All right, welcome back. So we're going to now kind of see where you saw this. All right, so we're looking for where we can use or we can find some evidence of the government playing a process in the role of industrialization. So if we carry our commercial industrial system, right? What Sergei Witt is proposing here to Tsar Nicholas is that the Russian government will subsidize, right? So if we're writing a DBQ paragraph, right? If we're actually writing a DBQ paragraph, we only need 3 to 5 words from the document as a piece of evidence, right? So if I'm making the assertion that the government played a role in the process of industrialization in Russia, I can then say in my body paragraph that the Russian government, under the direction of Sergei Witt, advocated that the Russian government carried the commercial and industrial system. So I think I just pulled about 4 words there. Now what I would have to do is I would have to explain that, right? I would have to explain how that evidence then supports my assertion. So I would say something to the effect of what is being illustrated here is that the government is advocating subsidizing Russian industries so that even though they can't compete against prices from manufacturers from Europe, they do want to maintain Russian-owned businesses until they can become competitive. Something along the lines of that, right? Just demonstrate the fact that Sergei Witt is advocating, he's advocating subsidizing Russian industry. Notice here he's not advocating, protectionism per se, as far as barring foreigners, right? So we're not seeing, foreign businesses being barred from Russia, nor are we in any way seeing foreign money from not being able to come in, right? Those are definitely on the table still. What we are looking at, what he is proposing here is subsidizing. All right, so that then could be your, so I just want to make sure you see how we would use evidence from the document. Don't need very much in order to prove our assertion, and then make sure you explain that back, and connect it back to your assertion, which is what I did by talking about the subsidies. All right, so that's that. All right, I think that's a good wrap-up point for today. All right, so some key takeaways from today. So the rapid development of steam-powered industrial production in European countries and the United States contributed to increasing the region's share of global manufacturing during the first industrial revolution, right? So there are definitely people who were winners in the industrial revolution. European countries, the United States are clear winners in this first stage. Others will be as well later on. B, Middle Eastern and Asian countries continued to produce manufactured goods, so it's not like they stopped completely, but their region's share in global manufacturing declined, right? You're seeing a general decline in their percentage of global GDP. In the whole shipbuilding in India and South Asia, the ironworks, some of those things come to an end on their own because of new technologies. Some of those things are forced to be shut down, right, by the British, like, for example, the ironworks. And then later some textile producers weren't necessarily shut down by producers, but they were shut out from access to getting their raw materials, cotton. You can't really be a textile producer if you don't have access to cotton because it's all being sold to England. All right, so you're seeing some, people who are not the winners of the Industrial Revolution. South Asia, Southeast Asia, obviously Egypt as well, because of decisions by their government. All right, so as new methods of industrial production become more common in parts of northwestern Europe, they spread to other parts, right? So, and tomorrow, this is what we're going to talk about is Japan, right? But we just looked at Russia real quick. All right, that's it for today. Sapriati. Unless you want to stay on for an extra minute. And then I'm just going to kind of go through some slides. These are not mine. I kind of pulled these off from various places on the internet. I think I pulled this off from, right, this definitely comes from, well, I guess the top part comes from Freeman, but I think I pulled this off from the song I think is where I kind of pulled this from, the Catherine the Great song, the Poker Face, Catherine the Great song. So I just kind of took the lyrics and summarized them for you. So Catherine the Great, right? And of course, one thing that kind of matches up with what we're talking about right now with Catherine the Great is that she opened access to trade with Japan. And if you remember back to that Sergei Witt passage, he actually does mention Asiatic trade, right? Asiatic trade. So Russia was able to compete against, manufacturers from Asia, just not Europeans. So that Asiatic trade had been, already well established for 100 years by the time Sergei Witt, makes those comments, or about 100 years. All right. So anyway, one of the other kind of interesting thing that Catherine the Great does is she partitions Poland, or she's involved in the partitioning of Poland. And if you kind of look at when this is all going down, all right. So pre-1800, this process undergoes. So, and I guess we are getting closer to Valentine's Day, and historical Valentines is a thing in this class. So, be thinking about interesting historical Valentine's Day cards. That'll be an extra credit assignment for you. All right, so I'm not gonna read through these. I'm just gonna maybe talk about a thing or two here and there, and then move on. But you're welcome to pause and read through if you're looking for some facts. Right. I think I pulled this off from a New York teacher's website. She's a Long Island teacher. When I mentioned the Crimean War, if you were not familiar with the Korean War, this is actually a pretty good little infographic on it. Emancipation of the serfs, right? So Tsar Alexander II. One of the easy ways to remember that, and I do actually say this in class, is the emancipation of the serfs and the emancipation of slaves in the United States happens at roughly the same time. So you get about a 2-year gap here between the two events. So, if you're able to identify when the Civil War takes place, then you should be able to remember that in the 1860s, the serfs were emancipated. Right. And also there's some similarities here as well. So just because the institution of serfdom was abolished doesn't mean new forms of coerced labor were not applied out. Similar to what happens in the United States, with the sharecropping system. You definitely see that happen in Russia as well. All right, early reforms made by Alexander II. In addition to Indian serfdom, and then just general reforms made in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. I'm going to move on. All right, so 1893. Right, Russia will take Georgia as a protectorate. They will annex Crimea. Okay. All right, and you're going to see eventually the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Right, so this is Tsar Alexander III. So you see kind of a heading or an initiation of this. And I believe this was mostly funded by the French. I think the French were large financiers, of this project. So European finance, European financed, Western European financed as well. Right, so massive undertaking. I'm going to cut across Siberia. Right, and of course, foreign policy, right, and this is something we'll kind of dig into a little bit later on as well, the whole pan-Slavism and all that kind of stuff, because this becomes one of the causes of World War One. So, Russia's kind of increasing role. outside of Russia, in eventual alliances. And of course, Marxism is something we really haven't mentioned in this class yet. Socialism in general, anarchism, that kind of stuff. And there is a day in a few days from now we will be, kind of introducing this as a concept. But Marxism, socialism. This is something that rises up as a reaction to industrialization. Often we see them in urban centers, and that rise up during the Industrial Revolution, and they will become a fixture. So it is one of the many reactions to the Industrial Revolution and industrialization in general. And as soon as Russia begins to undergo the process of industrialization, you're gonna start to see, the adoption of Marxist ideals. And it's one of those things where there were pre-existing radical ideas, anti-czarist ideas in place before industrialization even began. Of course, Mikhail Bakunin is one of the more famous radicals in Russian history. And he predates the rise of industrialization in Russia, right? So, an advocate of anarchism, if you're not familiar with him, right? But just be aware, Marxism and socialism and those kinds of ideologies are going to start to pop up in your documents now that we're at that point. All right. So there's a little Bakunin, right? Reference right there. Right. I don't think we need to get into nihilism in this class. It's more of an AP European history concept. Right. So, but anyway, these are going to become increasingly referenced, as we talk about Russia, in the coming months. All right, and this is actually one of the documents that we use later on when we talk about Russia. So just kind of introducing, and once again the verbiage, right? Bourgeoisie is not a new word for us, right? Bourgeoisie is not a new word for us, right? But peasants, serfs is what that's referencing, or former serfs, right? So, and after the 1890s, increasingly the urban workers. All right, there's also some other things going on, specifically between Russia and Japan. So Japan, as we mentioned in the last session, was already undergoing or had begun the process of industrialization following the Meiji Restoration in 1868. And one of the realities of Japanese industrialization is that there's very little raw materials that they have direct access to. So you're going to start to see an expansion or a creation of an imperialist Japanese state, very, very, very quickly, right? And which is also going to mean that Russia, which also is active in East Asia, Russia and both Japan are going to come into odds against Japan. So there's actually going to there'll be a Sino-Japanese war in the 1890s, and of course they will come head to head against the Japanese and the Russians. In the first couple of years of the 20th century. And this is a shocking defeat for many of the Russians by the Japanese, and there is an American connection to the Russo-Japanese War as well. The peace treaty was signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, right, for those of you guys who like random tidbits of information. So the Japanese will quickly defeat them, and this is gonna be one of the many reasons why there's gonna be a revolt that happens in 1905. So this is a Russian Revolution, right, in 1905. So when we talk about the Russian Revolution, this is not the one we're talking about. But there are some big things that come out of this. Most notably is the Duma. So the Duma is one of these major reforms, or a national parliament. So the beginning of a legislative tradition, right, a multi-party legislative tradition, gets created in the aftermath of this 1905 revolution. All right, that's about it. Just want to kind of just go through a little bit of Russian stuff, but Strayer does do a pretty decent job at this, so not really adding too much to what you don't already have access to. All right, I am out of here. Sapriati.